I want to talk about stories, why they matter, and who gets to tell them. Since I was very young, I've absolutely loved stories. Got that fringe. This is me when I was 4 years old, and my favorite story at this time was a book called Not Now Bernard by David McKee. It's a book about a little boy called Bernard who one day finds a huge man-eating monster in his back garden. Understandably, he's a little bit scared. He runs into the house and tries to grab his mum and dad, says, "Mum, Dad, there's a monster in the garden." Unfortunately, his mum and dad aren't interested, and they say, "Not now, Bernard." They're busy doing other things. So eventually, Bernard bites the bullet, goes back out into the garden, and decides to confront the monster. He says, "Hello," and the monster kills him and eats him. There he is, even the shoes. Thing is, Bernard's only small, and so the monster's still hungry. He decides to go into the house and eat Bernard's mum and dad too. So the monster goes into the house, and he roars at the mother, and he even bites the leg of the father, but both of them just say, "Not now, Bernard." They're both busy and don't even realize that their son has been replaced by a man-eating monster. By the end of the book, the monster's been fed Bernard's dinner and has been tucked up in bed by Bernard's mum. I love this story, and I used to get my mum and dad to read it to me over and over again. In particular, I think I love this last shot, this monster not knowing what to do, not knowing what is going on. But also, I love the fact that the main character's killed off in the first couple of pages. The twist, the surprise of it, and it's something I still love in stories today, something unexpected. Since then, as I got a little bit older, I thought about this story a little bit more. And actually, I'm struck by the deep sadness of it, because ultimately it's about this little boy who's completely ignored by his parents when he's terrified and ends up being eaten. And actually, when I think about it further, I realize that perhaps the monster and Bernard are meant to be the same character. They're the same person. The monster just represents Bernard when he's feeling isolated, when he's feeling lost, when he's feeling angry, like an outcast from his own family. And I think that that might be why Bernard's parents don't realize that their son has changed. I think this is a way that a lot of young people, a lot of kids sometimes feel, like an outcast, isolated, angry. And a story like this is a way to kind of work through that. Know that you're not alone in feeling that way. 26 years later, I've not really grown up and I still love stories. And not just because they're entertaining, because they're infinitely exciting and storytelling is so interesting. I've made a career about this, teaching, talking, sharing about stories every day. But I love stories because fundamentally I think they are the way in which we understand the world around us. Because our lives are short. Sorry, there's a lot of death in this. But if we're lucky, we live for 80, maybe 90 years. And our perspective, our experiences are limited in that time. They're limited by time itself. They're limited by space. We can only visit so many cities, so many countries, meet so many people. But perhaps most importantly, our time is limited by our perspective. There are 7 billion people in the world. Billions have went before us and billions will come after us. And yet we can only experience the world through one set of eyes. However, stories, they defy these limitations. For example, stories allow us to see the world through the eyes of a Russian aristocrat 200 years ago. We can experience what it is like to be an ancient Egyptian slave building the pyramids. We can even experience the thrill of murdering someone and hacking up the remains without having to go through with it ourselves. Presumably there's some guilt there as well, I should throw that in. We also can experience what it's like to lose someone that we've lived with and loved for 50 years. We can experience some of the most horrific and terrible examples of human history. But we can also share in our greatest achievements. Stories take us to worlds that don't yet exist, and worlds that never will exist. Indeed, life without stories is a life half-lived. The Roman playwright Terence, he argued in one of his plays that, he said, "I am human. I consider nothing human alien to me." These words are referring to our shared humanity. Whether we like it or not, we have much more in common with other human beings around the world than we may like to admit. And we have to share in the very best and the very worst deeds of all of humanity. And stories make us acknowledge and see this connection. Stories let us know that we are not alone, and that everything we experience, everything that we feel, has been felt and experienced by people before us. We can experience the world through the eyes of someone of another race, another religion, another nationality, gender, age, mental or physical capability, even someone of another species. And the power of stories to help us relate to other people or to empathize with other people has been proven by empirical studies. In 2006, the psychologists Marr and Oatley found that people who regularly read fiction were much more empathetic and open-minded towards others than those who didn't. Think about just the act of telling a story itself. A mother or father telling a bedtime story to their kid, or maybe some friends joking around, telling stories about funny things from the past. It brings people together. It closes down the space between different individuals. But more than this, stories also transmit our culture and our values. We tell small children stories to teach them the difference between right and wrong. We also, nations tell stories to establish their identity and the way in which they're unique in the world. Even religions use stories. The Torah, the Quran, the Bible, many religious texts are full of stories, and they use that to transmit and share their message. If you want to persuade someone of something, if you want to change someone's mind, facts are not enough. You have to tell a story. But what is a story? We can define it as something you read in a novel, something you see in a movie, maybe on a Monday morning, telling your friends about what you did at the weekend, all types of story. But we can broaden that definition even more. Stories are just a sequence of events or things that we choose to pull together. And fundamentally, they are the process through which we understand the world. Think of looking up at the night sky. You see hundreds, thousands of stars, and you know that behind that are millions and billions more. It's beautiful. It's stunning. It's chaotic. It's impossibly complex for one human being to understand or even come close to comprehending. And yet, what do we do as human beings? We draw lines between these stars, and we draw pictures. Constellations, like stories, are a way of making sense out of chaos. And these constellations, they only exist in the shared consciousness of human beings. And yet, sailors have used them for generations to navigate across vast oceans, long before the invention of compasses or satellite navigation. Like constellations, stories are our way of picking out narratives, making sense of a chaotic, complex world. There are billions of people everywhere, doing billions of things every single day. And we can pick out an individual, we can pick out an event, and we can tell a story that creates meaning from nothing. Indeed, the historian, Yuval Harari, in his book *Sapiens*, argues that this ability, this human ability to tell collective stories, shared fictions, is what separates us as a species. He identifies religion, or nations, or money, or even the idea of human rights as these shared stories that unite people and allow us to collaborate in a scale which would otherwise be unimaginable. And let me give you an example. This patch of land, this earth, 67 million people, give or take one or two, live in this patch of earth. Most of them, when you ask them, will identify as French. They will speak French, they will tell French stories, they will support the French national team at the World Cup. Why is that? Why do they have this shared identity? Part of it is pragmatics. Okay, they pay taxes towards a government that they then hope will provide services to them and protect them. But there's more than that. There's a shared sense of identity because these people have connected the stars and told a story of France in which they all believe. These narratives, these connected events, can have a huge impact on everyday life. The most obvious example is politics. Every single politician has to tell a story. They have to tell a story of a nation's past, and they have to give a vision or sell a story of a nation's future. Look at the United States. In 2007, 2008, Barack Obama told a story of hope and aspiration. Just him running for president told a story where 200 years ago a man like him may have been a slave and yet now could become the most powerful person on earth. His story, you can plot out some of the key points. Perhaps you look at the Emancipation Proclamation and Abraham Lincoln. Maybe then you look at the Civil Rights Movement and end with his inauguration as president. In 2016, Donald Trump told a very different story of America. He told a story of America's past of a great industrial power that had been undermined by Washington elites who were greedily stealing from the people. A story of immigrants and foreigners who were hoodwinking the United States and undermining its power. Now, both Obama and Trump are telling stories. They're picking out certain points, embellishing others, and they're constructing a narrative. And yet that narrative has had a huge impact on the citizens of the United States and the world. And this same process happens in every country with every politician. Have a look at this photo. It's from 2015. It shows the Irish Defence Force, the Irish Navy, saving a boat full of refugees in the Mediterranean Ocean. When we look at this picture, we have a choice about the story we tell. We can tell the story of a family who have lost everything, who have been forced out of their home and are desperately seeking safety. We can tell a story of an individual whose family has been killed, whose life itself has been threatened due to his political or religious beliefs. We can even tell the story of the naval officers on board this ship, tired, exhausted, saving people from the ocean, thinking about their own family back home and when they'll next get to see them. Or we can tell the story of one refugee in a million who commits a violent crime, or a nation that is full and cannot help. The story we choose to tell has, and more importantly perhaps, the story we choose to listen to, has a direct impact on the actions that we then take. So stories are powerful. They give us access to a huge range of experiences we haven't yet felt before. They inform our political, economic, and social narratives in which we believe and upon which we act. So if stories are really important in this way, we have to ask the question, who gets to tell them, and which stories do we listen to? The author, Chimamanda Adichie, in her TED talk, The Danger of a Single Story, talks about when she was a kid growing up in Nigeria, she read lots of stories by American and British writers, and she loved these stories. But all of the main characters were little white English children who played in the snow and drank ginger beer. They weren't kids who reflected her story, her background. And when I think back to the stories I read and studied when I was in secondary school and university, I didn't quite have that problem. I think about some of these writers who I loved and still do. Ernest Hemingway, you've got F. Scott Fitzgerald there, Shakespeare, this guy, you may know him. Gerard Manley Hopkins, great poet. You've got William Golding there, E.E. Cummings, Camus, and Yeats. And you may notice a pattern emerging in these writers. White men from Europe and America get to tell a lot of stories. And if you're looking for evidence, go no further than this stage right now. When I moved to Tanzania, when I started teaching in an international school with a huge number of different nationalities, it seemed absurd that these are the stories that I knew and that I cared about and that I was potentially going to then teach. Though I love these writers, it's quite a singular perspective, and their work is varied, but they're still coming from the same place. Instead, I committed to reading books just by African writers, trying to expand the range of writers and stories that I was accessing. After reading works by writers like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Chimamanda Adichie, Yagi Assi, Chigozie Obioma, many others as well, I've gained so much from seeking out writers with backgrounds different to my own. Because if stories shape the way we see the world, the people telling them should be representative of those who live in it. And the same goes for political and economic narratives that are told by politicians, by our journalists, by our academics. If you look at the UK and USA as examples, you have a massive underrepresentation of the media with people of color, Muslims, women, people from poorer backgrounds. In the UK, 51% of journalists attended a private school, a fee-paying school, even though that makes up just 7% of the population at large. Similarly, just 25% of newspaper front pages were written by women in 2017. And perhaps that's why you end up with stories like this. The Daily Mail, Britain's most popular newspaper, read by millions of people in the UK and around the world, decided that when Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, met with Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, to discuss Brexit, what really mattered was who had the best legs. Hollywood also suffers from this. It's the biggest storytelling industry in the world. Yet, only one woman has ever won Best Director at the Oscars. And when you dig into why, you can find that of all the writers and directors in Hollywood, only 11% are women, 89% are men. The result are films in which you have far fewer female characters. The female characters you do have play a narrow range of roles. They say less. Frankly, they do less and have less agency. In fact, the only things they do more of, the men, is take their clothes off. It's true. If you look at 900 of the most popular films between 2006 and 2017, 26% of female characters get nude or partially nude, against just 9% of men. Sorry. When our stories are exclusively authored by men, by the rich, by Europeans or Americans, by the older generation, then our culture, our economy, our politics, and even our moral rules tend to favor these people. I wonder if we were listening to the stories of the younger generation, we would still be facing the same climate crisis we do today. I wonder if rich and powerful countries around the world would still be shutting their doors to the most vulnerable if we were hearing stories of the dispossessed rather than those who were peddling bigoted views for financial or political gain. No one should feel like a monster in their own society. And stories have the power to change that. From making people laugh to encouraging us to empathize with others, to celebrating our own culture and shaping the political and social narratives that affect all of our lives. I encourage you to think carefully about the stories you listen to, the stories that shape your understanding of the world. Perhaps even more importantly, think about the stories you're not hearing. What stories are being suppressed? What voices are you not having access to? And finally, I would encourage you to think, to make sure you tell your own stories with confidence and with pride. Thank you.